In the last video, we talked about the history of the origins of the Jesuits. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about their work of evangelization, and especially evangelization, first of all, through education. So the Jesuits are going to become great patrons of arts and sciences across the world. The approach of the Jesuit spirituality is to see God in all things. So this means that a lot of the times when we're reading something from Ignatius and spiritual exercises, the approach is to imagine yourself in a scene from the gospel. And so this is the beginning of seeing the surroundings of nature as you imagine yourself on the Sea of Galilee, you imagine yourself in the city of Jerusalem, that the physical surroundings in some way shape your relationship with God, shape a degree of closeness you have with God. This obviously runs in opposition to Calvinism, which taught that what we experience through the senses distracts us from God. And so the Jesuits are promoting seeing God in all things, seeing knowledge of the world as a path towards a close relationship with God. And they use this approach to revive Catholic education throughout Europe. And they did this through the establishment of new universities throughout Europe, especially the Gregorian University in Rome, which you see depicted here. And so the Jesuits are a very important part of re-establishing Rome as a center of learning. Whereas we look at before the Reformation, Rome was a center of political intrigue and a center of the arts and a center of church politics. The Jesuits also helped establish Rome as a center of learning. By 1650, there are over 40 new Catholic universities across Europe. Most of them were Jesuit, and most of them had been founded as a way to better educate those who were training to be priests and bishops, something that the Council of Trent had called for. The curriculum stressed the study of humanistic disciplines. So in this way, again, we see a continuation and an implementation of the Renaissance. That taught that humanistic learning, the study of literature and history and languages was part of forming someone who could be a leader in the society. In this case, a religious leader, in this case, a priest. The Jesuits also published books on the sacraments, like confession. These are ways of defending these teachings and these practices that had been under attack from the Protestant reformers and explaining the justifications behind them. And for many, the promotion of humanism, the study of humanistic learning, this was seen as an antidote to the depravity of human nature that Luther and Calvin were preaching. So whereas Luther and Calvin had said that human beings were so depraved that they were distracted from God by what they were experiencing, the Jesuits taught that human beings could truly understand the world through the study of the humanities, and in studying the world, come to a greater or stronger relationship with God. The Jesuits are not only leaders in education, they're also missionaries to the New World. They establish the first colleges in the New World in the Americas, and more famously, perhaps, they establish missions. These were basically enclaves within Spanish and Portuguese controlled territory that were there to protect and evangelize Native Americans. So you're entering the New World has just gone through this huge change. There's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of instability, there's a lot of violence, and the missions of the Jesuits provide a place of safety and security for these populations. So the missions were set up by pairs of Jesuits who would go out, just two Jesuits with a military guard and an interpreter. They would approach a group of natives and they would set up an altar there and say Mass, and then they would begin building the mission. They would build a church, they would build a hospital. The church would typically have a square in front of it where the community would meet. Then houses and schools were built around the square in front of the church, and then walls and fortifications would be set up around the houses. And these buildings were built, as you can see, as the top picture here is an image of one of these missions that's been restored. They would be built by Native Americans, but they would use a Baroque style. They would be using the European style at the time, as you can see here. This is, in my opinion, so interesting, where you have a European church built in a European style, but it's been built by Native American workers, and it's been built I think this one is from South America. So you can see these different cultures intersecting and coming together. And so these places, these missions, provide stability for the Native American populations in an increasingly destabilized world. They also provide outposts for Spanish soldiers who are trying to establish Spanish rule and order in their new lands. And so the Spanish could use these missions as a base, having the Spanish soldiers there better protected the Americans. Who were the Native Americans being protected from in these missions? Often they were being protected against those who were trying to capture them and use them for slave trade. Now, slavery of Native Americans was prohibited both by the Spanish monarchs and by the Catholic Church very early on, but that didn't stop more unscrupulous people taking advantage of the fact that you're 5,000 miles away. If you enslave someone, if you capture someone, and someone is in need of labor, it might actually be quite easy to sell them off as slaves and sell them into slavery, and no one knows that this is going on, and they remain enslaved. And some of these slavers, some of those who were trying to enslave Native Americans, had armies of close to 1,500 soldiers. And so they would descend on a village, they would capture the Native Americans that they could, and they would sell them into slavery. And so having the Spanish soldiers who were committed to ending these illegal practices, having the missions with their fortifications, these provided important protections for Native Americans. The populations of these missions would become as large as 7,000 people. The day would begin with mass and with community prayer and a procession through the fields. Then everyone would work together in the fields until the afternoon, when there would be a siesta, and there would be frequent festivals and concerts and community events that were held at these locations. Apart from the main farm, so outside the walls and the fortifications, you have the fields and the lands of the mission. These were used for raising cattle, something that the Jesuits, a practice that the Jesuits would teach the Native Americans who were unfamiliar with these animals. Each individual house would have its own garden for raising crops and animals. And the Jesuits would teach the Native Americans other techniques that were necessary for them to make a living. So they would learn how to raise cattle and cultivate European crops. They would learn textile production. They would receive an education in literacy and in Christianity. They would learn metalwork. They would learn making music. All these skills that were necessary for Native Americans to make the transition to a world that was dominated by Europeans. That doesn't mean that the Spanish were disrespectful of Native American culture. Native Americans were taught to read not only in Spanish, but also in their own Native American languages as well. They learned how to write in their own language. So it's not as though the Jesuits were trying to destroy Native American culture, but they were trying to help Native Americans adapt to this new world at the same time as they're training them how to adapt to Christianity. We're going to stop this video here, and I'll talk about the Jesuits in Europe in the next one.